I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and paying my respects to elders past and present. I used to say past, present, and emerging, but then Chris Lee at Diabetes Australia said, oh, actually, no, not emerging now. And one of the things I loved about that was seeing the evolution of acknowledgements of country and thinking about how the dynamic and the relationship and the right thing to say changes and is evolving and is not frozen, is not fixed, but is part of that ongoing dialogue that Australia is having with itself, this land that is labelled Australia, about who we are and who we're going to be and how we're going to face up to our past. I am a half German, half English dual national. I was born in London and I grew up in a village called Drayton, and I went to school in a town called Warwick, about 9 miles down the road. And when I was working with Queensland State Government on the outskirts of Toowoomba, I saw this road sign which says something about the ways in which we remain entangled and that history is unfinished. And I was born in 1980, not 1788, but I continue to benefit from the fact that I get to speak the languages of the land where I was born without making any real effort to adapt to an Australian audience. And that question of rights and responsibility, power and privilege, who gets to say they belong to a place or that a place belongs to them, continues to be one that we haven't even fully yet acknowledged, let alone begun to put right. As Auntie Joan Bell said in the Welcome to Country this morning, it's about respect and responsibility, and even recognising that those of us who might seem in some ways to be foreign guests are also people who bear a responsibility because we bear the weight of that history as well. And the other thing I wanted to just also do is pay additional respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might also be in the room with us, apart from the traditional owners of the lands that we're on now, and to recognise the diversity of the many Aboriginal nations and communities and First Nations communities across Australia. So thank you for allowing me to acknowledge country in this way. And I also know there's a couple of New Zealanders at least amongst us here, so just in that spirit of broader welcome, also to say tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, and particularly to choose those words, welcome, welcome, welcome everyone, because I've been welcomed to Australia, then welcome to this event, but now I'm welcoming you to this next hour. And there's that moment where we're all coming together, and there might be one person in front of you on a stage, but actually even this moment is thanks to a lot of work behind the scenes by Energy Consumers Australia, thanks to Esther, Daniel and Paul at the back, who are looking after me with various dramas with AVs and mics, making everything run super smoothly, and to Angela as well, who's basically orchestrating everything. And I say this because it's never just about one of us alone. And the point of the next hour, I've kind of got, you know, what might be the graveyard shift in some ways. It's 3:30. Can you just give us something a bit sleepy? Not boring, but just we can kind of drift through it, check the phone, write down 1 or 2 quotes. Actually, if you've got up to 200 people in a room, like, is the best use of them that one person broadcasts for the next 60 minutes and you kind of absorb something? Or is it actually that we put everyone's brains to work on the issues that matter? So I'm hoping that we will have a broader conversation over the next 60 minutes, and I approach this in all humility and all respect. The management consultant Kees van der Heyden died last week, a brilliant and slightly unsung figure in the history of looking at organisations and strategy. And he wrote a book called The Art of Strategic Conversation. And he said, as soon as you have more than one person in the room, it becomes this conversation about what's happening and what are we going to do. And he talked about the idea that there are people with the power to perceive, people with the power to think or to analyse the situation, and people with the power to act. And at any moment, we might occupy one or more of those positions. We might move between those positions in a dance during the course of a conversation or during the course of our operations. But actually, the aim is really to find, there's been a lot of talk about literacy and language, and do we all speak the same language? Not that we all speak the exact same language, but we find a common ground for communication. And again, I've heard that through the various panels and presentations today. So finding sufficient common ground that we can have a conversation about what's going on and what do we need to do next. And I want to see if we can achieve some of that over the next 60 minutes. I'm realistic that even when I say, I make no effort to accommodate to an audience over here, actually there are beautiful opportunities for mutual lack of understanding between Australian English and the English I grew up with. I kind of got bottle-o, I kind of got bolo. I struggled with robo for a robotic car wash. And I was once in a conversation where there was a paramedic who used to be a soldier, and someone, without thinking, just went, "Oh yeah, the Rambo Ambo," just assuming I would understand what that meant. So, because it's not just about me broadcasting, and you know way more about the Australian energy sector than I'm ever going to know, and way more about this country and the wider context, 2 rules, little guidelines for the time that we have together. Voices for everyone and get things done, not perfect. The first one, voices for everyone. By that, I do not mean that at any moment you are obliged to speak. You are going to be forced to hold forth or step into the spotlight, but quite the opposite. If you're having a conversation at your table or with anyone in the room, to look around and think, who haven't I heard from yet? Whose opinion am I curious about? If you're like me and someone says, what do you think? And you're like, I've got 3 ideas already, let me give you all 3. Before you let loose, just look around and say, who should I ask what they think before I have a go and share my ideas? So it's about taking responsibility for listening to one another and hearing one another's voices. Even the fact that Energy Consumers Australia has that logo that is like a sort of sound wave when it animates, and the Twitter handle is Energy Voice AU, and the fact that one of the most difficult conversations that's being had politically in Australia right now is exactly about this question of voice. What I want to make sure is that we take responsibility for hearing one another over the next 60 minutes. And get things done, not perfect, is really obvious. Are we going to save and transform the world in a single 1-hour session at the tail end of a foresighting forum this far past lunchtime? Maybe not. But we can start to have conversations where something happens where you think, oh yeah, okay, I hadn't thought of that. Or, oh yeah, maybe we need to do that differently. Or, okay, that forced me to question what I think is going on. And it's not even if it happens in the next 60 minutes. It might happen when you're heading home this evening. It might happen tomorrow in the second day of the forum. It might happen next week. But just to be open to that idea, we'll do the best we can in the time we've got, and we'll carry something with us from the conversation in this room out there into the world where hopefully it can make a difference. And all that just to get to the title slide. I sort of picked this title, but it was sort of given to me by Energy Consumers Australia. They said, would you do something about the challenges and opportunities of socio-technical systems change? I was like, it's a bit dry, but let's go with it. And I said, oh yeah, we'll put working with uncertainty up front. You know, it's 3:30, they'll go, oh yeah, okay, we're all interested in systems change, but we can drift off a little bit. But actually, that initial conversation was so useful because it was like electric, because I was being told exactly what we needed to worry about. And I'm going to pick 2 words out of that title, and we're going to play with them for most of the time that we have together. So the first one is really just to look at this question of uncertainty. Because we've heard it already, we've talked about it. Am I supposed to come here and be the guy who has the answer to uncertainty? Uncertainty is always going to be there. You cannot gather one shred of data or evidence from events which haven't happened yet. So any data-driven engagement with the future is really about confidence in your own predictive model. And the fact is, you know, I clean out the coffee pot in the evening so it's ready for me to have coffee the next morning because I'm pretty sure I'm going to want coffee. I'm pretty sure the kettle's going to switch on when I press the button. But even that is taking a bet on what is going to lie ahead of me after I've slept and got up the next morning. So uncertainty is always with us. It's not going anywhere, and we have to engage with it. So in that spirit, I went to the Art Gallery of New South Wales yesterday, and I bought 200 postcards. And then in my crabby handwriting, I wrote an individual postcard for each and every one of you. You should find those postcards on your table. If you find that you're really without one, you can make yourself known, and the lovely people at Energy Consumers Australia have some spares. This is what I'm going to suggest that you do. You have a postcard with a question on it. I am going to give you 10 minutes. And what I want you to do is see what questions are on your table and then what answers arise. You can take that however you want to. What questions are on your table and what answers arise? You've got 10 minutes. I'm going to stop you right exactly there, mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-question, mid-thought. Wherever you are, I'm going to stop you at that exact right instant. Because You didn't know what you were in for. I didn't know how this was going to go. I started writing these postcards at 9 p.m. and by 11 p.m., who knows if they're even legible. So some of you might have had postcards, I don't know what this says. But you had 10 minutes just to try and address that task. And it is connected to this word of uncertainty of, I didn't know how this bit was going to go. You didn't know even what the other people held at the table. You had to find some way of using this time that was productive or meaningful to you. You had a bit of direction, but not much. And as always in life, you don't necessarily know you've actually got the right answer. It's not like some cosmic hand is going to come down and mark your homework, and there's never enough time. There's just never enough time. We did scenarios for the future of the European Union. We had 3 years, wasn't enough time. So you had 10 minutes. I want you to take it one step further, and I'm going to give you another 3 or 4 minutes to just reflect. How did that feel? And how did you respond to the task? When you were told, see what questions are at the table and see what answers, how did that feel? And then how did you as a group address that task you'd been given? I'm just going to give you 4 minutes to talk about that. And I'm just going to bring you back together there one more time. Now, if I was maybe a little bit more energetic and we had a little bit more time, this is the moment where I would like charge around the room and stick a microphone in your face and say, so, what did you say in your group? And I even have like a couple of plants in the room with hot mics ready to stick microphones in your face. But no, let's just hold on to what we were thinking there and whatever we've learned and whatever we laughed about and whatever frustrations or moments of, oh yeah, we had in that little conversation, hold on to them. We might have some time for reflections at the end. Because actually, we didn't even get past the title slide yet. But if you're going to talk about uncertainty, you might as well feel it a little bit. And it's never like the complete uncertainty of a leap into the void, is it? It's always like there's already something there. There's a bit of infrastructure. There's an institution. There's a community. There's a way of talking. So there's always something like the postcards or like someone setting you a task, but still there's this feeling of like, oh, are we doing the right thing? How are we going to go about it? Have I made sense of this thing that's before me? So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to feel that and then reflect on how you dealt with it just now in this session. The other word that I loved about this title, it's not an easy title to get really excited about, let's be honest, even though we're all interested in this topic. But the other word I really liked was socio-technical. Because it just sounds like, oh yeah, I know what that means, right? Social plus technical, infrastructure, technology, and institutions, communities. I don't even need to look it up. I know it's a bit of jargon, but I don't need to look it up in the dictionary. Socio-technical, great, yeah, I know what it is. But then you start to pull on that thread a little bit and say, where does this word come from and what does it really mean? And one of the roots you can trace it to is this guy, Eric Trist, who was one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, which was founded in the UK during the Second World War as a way of looking at sort of questions of leadership and management. And then it evolved. It is part of the National Health Service in the UK. And it looks at organizations and communities and groups, but not just in terms of the stuff you can see on the surface, the stuff that's on the org chart, the questions that get voted to the top of the Slido poll, but the stuff that goes unsaid, the stuff that goes on within us and between us, the stuff that is sometimes under the table or said in the corridor or said in the back room. It doesn't have to be in a psychoanalytic sense, it doesn't have to be about the unconscious, but it's the things that we're not saying. And one of the things that Trist was particularly interested in was this idea of what goes on within and between us in organizations that maybe you can't see on that formal chart. And the other aspect of this, and I should say I'm training at the Tavistock at the moment, it's 3.5 hours a week on Zoom. 1 hour of that, this is for group facilitation. 1 hour of that is basically group therapy on Zoom. They put you in a room for 1 hour and say, just observe what's going on in the group. And there's tears, fights, arguments. Where did this come from? The only task was observe what's going on in this group. And then someone has a meltdown every time. But the other thing that Trist was really interested in was context. And you thought my title was dry. Here is an even drier title, The Causal Texture of Organizational Environments. But actually what he was interested in was the idea that what organizations do, or communities, or groups do, and even what their identity is so affected by the uncertainties that surround them. And the paper's from 1965. It's really very good if you can get through the sheer sort of dryness of it. It's a very scholarly piece. But made a diagram. That's all right. It's not quite as onerous in some ways. This is a way of thinking about those causal textures and this idea of context that we use at the business school where I work in Oxford. And the idea is, you can see here, there's an orange organisation that wants to think about the future or that faces uncertainty. And this organisation inhabits a kind of island that we can call the transactional environment. And on that island are all the entities, all the actors that you have a direct relationship with. All the different institutions and communities and groups that you interact with in the course of doing your business. But beyond that transactional island, there is a contextual sea of uncertainties which could come ashore and redraw the map that you operate on, change the values, change who the winners and losers are, change who the actors are even in times to come. So you can see here we've got an organisation that's got customers, suppliers, investors, governments, members of the public, competitors. It's all pretty straightforward. And then up there you've got geopolitics, finance, macroeconomics, energy prices, social values, technology, demographics, and ecology. And then the question becomes, this is a map of the present. This isn't a scenario. This is a map of the here and now. But how are those forces in the sea going to come ashore, singly or in combination, in times to come? And to give you a very swift example, you could imagine, for example, that orange person or entity that wants to learn about the future is a New York taxi driver in the early 2000s. And driving a yellow cab in New York in the early 2000s is pretty straightforward. It's been the same way for a lot of the 20th century. Basically you get passengers, they put up their hand, you pull over and pick them up. You charge a certain rate per mile that you travel or a certain rate per minute that you wait. You pay to go on the tolls. You maybe collaborate with other drivers in the union, but obviously you also compete with them. You probably have a mechanic that you go to, you have a gas station that you go to, and the New York City Licensing Authority will let you buy a taxi license, which is called a medallion, and is quite a significant investment for a cabbie. You'll interact with them to have the license to drive a taxi in New York. It's worked the same way. You see Cary Grant doing it in North by Northwest in the 1950s. It's still working the same way 50 years later. But out there in that sea of uncertainty, beyond your little island on the island of Manhattan, there's all these things brewing: technological changes, regulatory changes, changes in social values. And when some of those currents come ashore together, then the map gets redrawn. So the tech change, we were already talking about it. We were talking about the idea of the smartphone. The smartphone arrives and it's a technological change. But that's not enough alone. There's a regulatory change where they deregulate aspects of public transport in New York. And then most importantly, the bit we all overlook, social values change because suddenly people think it's okay to let a complete stranger drive with you in your car for money. And it's only when all three of those things come together that you get ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, and suddenly your island is redrawn, and the question of was it a good idea to pay for a New York taxi license becomes a completely different calculation because you're in a completely different environment. So do you know what we're going to do now? There is A4 paper, no expense spared, A4 photocopy paper on your tables. And what I'm going to ask you to do is take a piece and put it landscape with the long sides, the top and bottom. Make sure you each have a piece of A4 from your table. And on this piece of paper, I just want you to draw one of those islands. So just at the bottom of your piece of paper, give us a nice big egg shape. You can see my great skill with PowerPoint here. And then, as you get that island drawn, what I want you to do is you're going to populate it. And you're going to do the best you can in a very short period of time. I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I want you to put every actor you can think of in the Australian domestic energy system on that island. So when you think about the suppliers, the consumers, the regulators, all the different entities that are involved in domestic energy in Australia, you have got just 2 minutes to do the best job you can. Populate that island. You've still got 90 whole seconds. That was just 30 seconds. It was nothing. And you can just figure out the right level of granularity, right? Is it just a group or is it specific entities? See what comes to you. Now you've had half your time. 60 seconds left. And you can't go wrong here because it's like just drawing a map to go to the corner shops. You just do the best you can. Pen on paper. What actors play a part in the domestic energy system in Australia? You've got 30 seconds. Last few seconds. I can see steam coming off someone's pen over here. Someone else just staring into the void. I've got no idea. Someone else checking their phone. Checking their phone to research who's on the island, I hasten to add. You've done the best you can. Very quick, top of the head. These are the actors in the Australian domestic energy system. Not perfect, but good enough in 2 minutes. Guess what? There is a sea of uncertainty surrounding that island, and you are now going to populate that sea. And the way you are going to do that is I want you to think, what forces beyond our direct control influence the actions of the people on that island? So you can think about geopolitics, the environment, social, technological, ethical changes. What are the forces beyond our control that affect the decisions of people on that island? And some of the forces might affect just one actor, some of them might affect 2 or 3, some of them might affect the whole island, but you've got 2 minutes to fill that sea with the forces beyond our control that affect actors on that island, that drive their decisions, shape their choices. And now you've had half your time. You've got 1 minute left. Maybe some of the forces are really specific and really local, and someone like me would never know what they are. Some of them might be huge, like climate change, like the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. There might be social changes, populism might be in there. But as well as the big things, there will be things that are small and local that I don't even have a clue about. See if you can get them on the map as well. Wonderful. Looks good to me. Looks like icons. I've seen that before. It's good. 20 seconds left. Just whatever you can come to, the best you can in the time that you've got. Last few seconds. And I'm so grateful to you for your silence and your focus and the fact that you're seriously doing this. It moves me. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wherever you've got to, that's what you've managed in the time that you've got. And the last thing I'm going to get you to do alone with this piece of paper is just to look at this map. You know, look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. I want you to look at this map and just think, what have I got here? What of those forces in the sea of uncertainty could come ashore and redraw that island? But not in the ways, we've talked a lot today. You've all got predictions and forecasts and everything. You've got scenarios you've had presented to you. I don't want to know about the things you have expected. I don't want to know about the things you already know to hope and fear and anticipate. I don't want to see the futures you've already read in a report, even if it was a really good report. I want you to look at these factors in the sea and say, what ways could they come ashore that would really challenge my assumptions, that would really mess me up? It doesn't mean they have to be dystopian. It might be a future that's too bright to hope for. But just take a moment and look now and say, in what ways could that sea come ashore that would really mess with my expectations about what's coming? And I'm literally just going to give you 1 moment, just silently, to look at that map. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is now, once again, we're just going to take, say, 8 glorious minutes. And at your table, I just want you to talk about what's come up for you making that map, what you see that might be coming ashore. Find out what the other people on your table have said, see where there are similarities, see where there are differences. Just talk about what you've learned from that mapping process or what might have surprised you when your own pen touched the page. And I have to pull you back together here now. I'm sorry to have to bring you back and just conclude that moment of conversation, because I can only imagine how much longer you want. And I can only imagine that 8 minutes is just not enough to even get round sharing those maps. But again, it's not whether we change the world in a single 60-minute session. It is that idea of just having this feeling of what it means, first of all, earlier in this session, to face uncertainty, and then to start to try and find a map that we can agree on or find where we differ as we try and understand this territory of uncertainty that we inhabit. And so what I hope is it's as much about the feel of actually saying, do I even see this situation the same way as the people next to me on the table? Do I perceive the same actors and relationships? Do I perceive the same forces? Never mind thinking about what their implications are. Because the thing I'm starting to feel, the reason I was interested in how will these things come ashore and change the map, the longer I do foresight work, the less interested I am in people's bright visions for tomorrow. Because I always think of that story of King Canute, he was an English king or British king, who sat on the shore and commanded the waves not to come in. And of course, the waves came in nonetheless. And the strange thing about this island life is, of course, we always have some agency. You always have some agency in life, even if it's only, where do I turn my head? Where do I look? Who do I listen to? Where do I plant my next step? No one is so constrained they have zero agency. But the truth is, it's also the case that none of us have complete agency either. No one waves the wand and gets exactly the world that they want. So in a way, what I'm really interested with foresight, it's not the only way of looking at it, but the longer I do it, I'm not interested in creating a bright tomorrow for my children's children. When I go out in UTS and it's O Week out there right now, and there's all these basically children being like, do I want to join this Marxist organization or the ice skating society, or like, you know, you can't get into the building right now, and it is glorious. What I'm interested in is thinking, like, what are their children's problems going to be? And can we solve them before they arise? So it doesn't mean we have to look at dystopia, but I'm more interested in looking at challenging futures than the future that I think I want in 2023. And I'd go a step even further and say, I like to look at the futures, like the scenarios that Yolanda and the team have made, and say, how will they judge us? Never mind what I think the future I want is from my ignorant perspective of 2023. What will people in 2050 say about the decision I am taking right now? Depending how the future plays out, how will we be remembered for the choices we're making and the values we espouse? And we can create the benefit of hindsight by opening ourselves up to that judgment of multiple tomorrows. Now, because we are in the uncertainty business, I did a few things that one does in these situations, like I had some redundancies. I had some backup slides. There's a nice slide here about scenarios, but that's going to be like a stranded asset. Like, yeah, I had a slide. We're not doing it. I did bring one thing with me as well, because I had a fear. I'll be honest. I was like, well, you know, they've got this Pom over, and he's got an hour, and he's just made us draw stuff and talk. Like, what did this guy bring to the table? And, you know, I went to the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I got some postcards. I did my homework. But I did go and interview 4 colleagues from the Northern Hemisphere just to bring some insights that couldn't have come from this room. Because I do think if you've got 200 or so people together, it's better to have all 200 brains working on the problem. It's better to have a conversation than just a broadcast. But I also think it's possible to bring something from outside the room in that might be useful. And there's a proverb, it's told various different ways, but one version of the proverb is that one piece of jade can only be polished by another piece of jade, but that second piece of jade must come from a different mountain. So I just brought 4 little pieces of jade, 4 quotes from people I talked to, and there'll be a PDF of this slides with way more stuff. Even the quotes are meatier than the ones that are going to be on the screen right now. But it's just to provoke a bit of thought. The first one comes from Jose Maria Valenzuela, who is at the University of Oxford and has just done scenarios for the UK energy system with the energy system operator. And one of the things that he remarked on at the end of this process is he said, actually, one of the really big uncertainties around low carbon generation is power to X. We'll use this power to do something, but we don't yet know what, instead of losing it to curtailment. And he was laughing. He's saying it's literally X the unknown. It's right there and no one talks about it. What are we going to do with this power? Are we going to use it to produce hydrogen? Are we going to use it to capture CO2, which is very energy intensive? We literally use the variable X, meaning the unknown. The uncertainty is right there before us. And he said, so what are we going to do to shape life on that island and decide what X is? And he compared it to the early days of electricity, when the electricity suppliers were also in the appliance business, because they wanted people to use machines that were powered by electricity. So weirdly, your electricity supplier was also like, hey, use machines that are driven by electricity. So he says, what does that mean for this coming age? What are we going to decide to put in where it says X the unknown? A previous forum guest, Jeff Hardy from Zinc and Imperial College London. It's a bit like this idea of judging people from the perspective of the future. He says, traditionally, you've regulated on the basis of what the data tells you is harm. But our definitions of harm might evolve, just as the system does. So how do we anticipate what's coming next? Sandboxes are one way of addressing this issue, but it's not enough merely to relax regulations. A temporary derogation without learning will not teach us anything. And I like this idea of actually, how will we even construe harm in times to come? What will that future generation think that we didn't even recognize as being harmful? So how can we anticipate? And that notion of the sandbox, that we need to experiment as well as try and perceive what is unfolding around us. The OECD's work on anticipatory governance is very good on the idea that you have to experiment alongside foresight. But how do you do useful experiments that you genuinely learn from? Third piece of jade, Camilla Chlebner from Kiel University, and she was looking at Germans' resistance to installing things like wind turbines. And she talks about the different ways that communities see landscapes. She says what looks like empty land in the north of Germany, for example, perfect for wind energy, is perceived by some locals as the Tuscany of the north, a place that will be spoiled by the installation of turbines. And she says that she likes to look at things at a regional level precisely because the region is an intermediate unit. It forces us to be aware of the dynamics both within and without. If you go too small, you're thinking about family squabbles. If you go too big, you get to this geopolitical level that means nothing to the actual decision that has to be made. And the two things I taught from talking to Camilla, I was thinking about the early days of colonization in Australia, and when British natural scientists tried to draw flora and fauna of the landscape, and they drew them wrong, because they drew them through colonial eyes. And we've seen these images where actually they've drawn European animals and European plant life. They're not seeing clearly. And there's something in what Camilla says there about whether land is empty or valued, to say how do different communities perceive the physical, the virtual, the economic landscape? Are we seeing things clearly, and are we seeing things that just through the own filter of our own lens? And I like that idea of the regional, like actually we need to pay attention to external and internal pressures, especially Australia with the state and federal and LGA system. What is the right level of granularity for each decision for it to be meaningful and accountable? Last comment is from Madeleine Gabriel at Nesta. She heads their Sustainable Future mission, and she says, to understand decarbonisation from consumers' perspective, we need more granularity of data. At the moment, there's wasted effort in the UK where lots of people are all independently trying to solve the same problem, helping households find the quickest, cheapest, and most effective route to decarbonisation. The more data that can be provided to the sector as a whole, the better. That could mean putting information in the commons to support a range of different groups, coming up with new solutions and services, public sector, startups, and charities. And the things this sparked for me was looking at the ways in which organizations are moving to open strategy. The ways that, for example, Wikimedia Commons, when it builds strategy, it does it completely openly with its community. It's radical, it's challenging. Figuring out how to make that meaningful and accountable is incredibly difficult. But if decision-making becomes something that is so democratized and so open, can that apply to energy? Is that beyond our wildest dreams? Where is the limit of how open we can be? And it made me reflect on what Ruby was saying as well about different ideas of sharing and accountability and how those things might play out and which communities the sector might choose to learn from. And it also made me think of the comments that were made about cyber risk as well. That was Neil earlier on. I work with the European Cybersecurity Agency and other actors in that field. And what I would say is with cybersecurity, it's not a question of if, but when. For almost everyone, everything is going to get breached at some point. So the question is not, can you shore up the walls, but what do you do when someone gets the data? Because it's almost certainly going to happen. The last thing I want to do is return to the island, and I hope I'm all right for time. I'm mindful that we're just coming up on the half hour, 2 minutes. I'll whiz through this. So we have the factors and the sea of uncertainty. What are we going to do about it? Well, one of the things we can do is start to think about the relationships on the island and the difference they make, not from the perspective of one central actor, but all of these different entities. What value is being created through their interactions? And actually, if we start to think relationally, if we start to build new collaborations, we heard at the start of the day the suggestion that there would be an international collaboration with Paul's team. Is there a collaboration to have with health, with aged care, with different sectors? What you can start to do is actually reclaim some land from the sea, start to bring some uncertainties within your sphere of influence. And it's not that wacky of a thing to do. Banks used to issue their own credit cards, but actually that just meant they were all in competition in different systems. Visa and MasterCard expanded the island for everyone by creating a network where banks and customers and the retailers were all connected. So instead of every bank having a competing credit card, they built a network where everyone gained from the process. So one of the things that interests me is how far could you build those relationships that would actually reclaim some of that uncertainty from the sea? And there was a comment as well about like over-designing systems, right? Like how can we possibly get everyone to do what we want to do? Was it Anna who was saying, she drew on the imaginary friends comment and she said, you know, wouldn't it be nice if people just populated this beautiful system that we've designed, like behaved the way we wanted them to? It is really difficult to get all these actors to line up in the way that you want. But what you can do is invite them to dance, to find the offering that starts to configure the system in the way that matters. And it's as simple as if you invite people to the theatre, you have a theatre ticket. And by buying that ticket, it's like the invitation to dance. And the theatre will decide what play is on, they will get the actors, they will do the lighting, they will do the box office, they will pay the rent, they will run the bar. A whole bunch of relationships are configured. And that ticket means I am going to participate in this dance and I am going to get that evening of entertainment. And there are scads of corporate examples. I don't want to use my last minute giving these examples, but Rolls-Royce rents power by the hour, power by the hour. It doesn't sell engines anymore. It says you rent from us the ability to move a plane from A to B. And we will configure who the mechanics are and what's happening at the airports. And actually what you need from us is the ability to move the plane. It resonates with some of what Paul was saying about energy as a service. So that ability to dance is there. And there's so much more that can be said, but I want to end with this. Energy is fundamental to everything that we do, and the story of heat, light, and power on this continent did not begin in 1788. It goes back thousands of years, because human beings are always working with heat, light, and power to live. And it's also absolutely fundamental to the future of this nation. So in Italy, the railway in the 1990s, they faced this problem. They were a state entity, and they were going to become a private corporation. The Italian railways are actually older than Italy itself. They were founded before Garibaldi united the nation, so they have a really weird place in Italian national life. And then in the 90s, because of the European Union, they were going to have to radically reconfigure and become a totally different kind of enterprise. They didn't just do island and sea stuff for themselves. They went and wrote a book of scenarios called Reinventing Italy. Richard Norman was one of the architects of this value-creating systems approach. Lorenzo Necci was at the Italian Railway Service. It was messy and dirty. It was mafia and corruption trials and union battles and politics. It was not pretty in any single way. But what they decided was, to actually figure out the future for the railways, we have to do something bigger than just our own little island. We have to figure out what it means for the future of our nation. So they actually went above their pay grade, above their scope, and said, what is the future of Italy that our railways are going to exist in? Which leads me to wonder, how far are you going to go? Because energy is going to matter, And this country has to figure out who and what it is going to be and for whom in times to come. And for me, that's the real question behind the Foresighting Forum, is really how big are you going to go and what can we do to help with the bravest and toughest choices that await. Thank you so much. That's our time. Thank you.